Hey everybody, and welcome back to our online beer tastings for our most subscribed beer event so far. Thank you all so much. This has been a huge success for us. We have sour beer for you tonight featuring a lambic, and I have found both the most informative and most annoying lambic expert I could possibly think of in Adam Harbaugh, founder of lambic.info, the Lambic Wiki. Adam is a personal friend of mine because I have amazing friends, and he is going to work with us on this wonderful sour beer event. Now, we have forgotten the iPad/laptop, so I am on my phone tonight for comments. So if I'm a little behind on the comment side, that is why. It's not that I'm ignoring you, it's just that we don't have the proper technology in front of us. So tonight we have 3 kettle sours, we have 2 Berliner Weisses with various flavorings, and we also have a Florida Weiss, and we'll be talking about the difference between those two. And finally we have the topic that our guest is massively well informed on, which is an original Belgian lambic. Welcome, Adam. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hey, Kyle. It's good to see you from this far away.
Yeah, Adam's the person that I have beers with about yearly. He lives down in Montana. One of the world's foremost, most well-read experts on, Brussels-based Belgian lambics living in Montana is a weird irony, but and he's very far from his hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania. So we'll get into the beers here. Hand, could I get a glass, please? Oh, thank you. That's not what Hand was hoping for. He thought he was getting a beer, but no, he's getting me a glass. As it turns out, thank you. I'll give you that one, and I'll take this one. So we are going to start out with a Berliner Weiss here, and this one's actually from New Zealand. This is from 8 Wired Brewing out of New Zealand, and this is actually the beer that prompted me to do this tasting. I tasted this for the first time and said, oh dear God, this is delicious for 4% alcohol. I love this so much I have to do a sours tasting, because I had no idea how else it was going to fit in a cucumber hippie sour. I love this, and I apologize. I could have gotten these beers to Adam. Adam, unlike Mark last week, folks, Adam does not have all the beers in front of him. He's in the U.S., and there was no way in 10 days I could actually get the beers to him. That just wasn't going to happen. So Adam is unfortunately beerless. Well, he's not beerless. What are you drinking, Adam? What do you have in front of you right now?
I've got 2 bottles in front of me currently. First one is one of my favorite American farmhouse beers, the Petit Prince from Jester King. And I would say that if there is a great American songbook equivalent to beers, that would be one of the canonical beers in there. And I've also got a Dreifonteinen Oude Geuze Golden Blend, the original batch from 2011. So digging deep into the cellar there.
And you do have quite the cellar. We may ask you... Now, you're on your phone tonight, I believe.
Yeah.
We may ask you to take us on a tour of your cellar at some point tonight.
Oh, boy. Have you been down here since I finished
I've
the
not,
cellar?
no. I've not been down since COVID and all that.
Yeah.
And my wildly
closings.
unreliable Volvo also. That doesn't help. So let's talk a little bit about the beer we got in front of us, because the folks at home have beer in their glasses. So this is the 8 Wired Cucumber Hippie. I never declare a favorite beer in the store, because that's wildly unfair to the 1,000 other beers that we have going at a time. This is just magic to me. So this is a Berliner Weiss. This is a style that came out of Berlin. This was actually the best-selling style in Berlin at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Almost died out by World War II in the sense that nobody was drinking sour beers, very much in the same way that lambic almost died out in that same period. And has really come roaring back in the modern era with kettle sours, Berliner Weisses, Florida Weisses, and all these sour beers that don't take years to brew. Now, there's a huge difference, Adam, between lambic and between these faster styles. And without being, too disparaging, do you want to talk a little bit about how lambic is made and compare that to, say, like a faster fermenting sour?
Yeah, I mean the lambic process is quite a bit different from a traditional Berliner brewing process. Lambic takes the turbid mashing process, and then it'll move itself to essentially a large open vat, usually copper or steel, where it cools off overnight, and it sort of starts to pick up some of the wild yeast, the wild flora, the microflora that's in the air. And then after it cools overnight, it'll get pumped into barrels, oak barrels, where it'll sit for anywhere from 1 to 3 to 4 or even more years than that. And so the process to make a lambic is very slow, very long, very arduous. Whereas Berliners, they tend to come around a bit quicker, right? They don't have the spontaneous fermentation aspect and the maturation process in wood.
And again, the process. So when you're talking about that big copper fermentation vat, that's what we call a cool ship. Yes.
Yes, indeed, it is a cool ship.
So we're talking about a beer where they take this, wort made largely from unmalted wheat. They mash it. They add very, very old hops. They pump it up to the cool ship to naturally infect it with wild yeast. They don't add a yogurt culture or anything like you would with the Berliner Weisse. And then they run it off into barrels and they let that age for years, sometimes a year, sometimes up to 5 years, and then they often will create a blend of multiple years to create that.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that these younger beers and lambics will have in common is sour beer on its own sometimes can be well delicious, maybe a little bit one-dimensional. Very often you'll see adjuncts or flavorings added. Here we have cucumber. Here we have an absolute laundry list of different fruits that I refuse to memorize. It's blackberry, blueberry, currant, raspberry, and like 3 other things that I can't quite all nail down. This beer has the lovely rhyming name of lemons, limes, and clementines. But with lambic, fruited and flavored lambics are very traditional. As you well know, I'm an absolute fanatic for elderflower lambics. But there's lots of different things that are famous for being added to lambics. Why don't you talk about some of the more unconventional flavorings that have been added to lambics in your experience?
Well, I think it's probably a little more important to talk about the more traditional flavorings and sort of where it started, and it moves past that. Traditionally, you had lambic, straight lambic, not blended. You had Geuze, which was a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old lambics by and large. And when it got to the fruited side, the first ones that really became popular were Kriek, which were made from sour cherries that were local to the region. And then not maybe too long after that, they started using raspberries, so framboise. And then I think probably the first grape experimental lambic that we know about was in the mid to late 80s with Cantone. They used a white wine grape and macerated it with lambic. And past that, in the last probably 5 or so years since 2015, this explosion of lambic has created a massive, massive market for fruited lambic, anywhere from local plums, cassis, so blackcurrant, peach, blueberry. There's a new one out with apple in it from Decam. And so pretty much any fruit you can find these days, it's probably been put in lambic. There's been passion fruit lambic.
How would it turn out?
The passion fruit lambic was a bit sour, but they didn't get to use fresh passion fruit. They used a puree.
Now, that's not that uncommon with a lot of these sour ales. Like Berliner Weisse, one of the things that separates it from Florida Weisse is rather than putting fresh fruit right into the fermentation, they'll add a fruit syrup right at the very, very end. And as I understand it, that's quite traditional for a lot of lambic producers as well. Now, there are some lambic producers doing it with fresh fruit now, but historically it's always been syrups. So very often syrups right in the bar itself.
Well, for a good while after World War II in particular, when Europe was sort of experiencing this rebuilding period, there was a lot of American influence, and sort of what started to come in there was a thirst for sort of sweeter drinks. Soda pop like Coca-Cola became a big thing, and just the natural acidity of lambic became less and less appealing over time. And so that's when you started to see a lot more fruit added. You also started to see a lot more sugar added at first, right at the bar, they would take a sugar cube or something and toss it into the glass and use a special crusher called a lambic stomper to sort of dissolve the sugar into it. And that more or less led to the prevalence of sweetened lambics you see today. Things from, Lindemans. Most people are familiar with the Creek and the Apple and the Peach. And then slowly but surely, there was a bit of a renaissance in lambic, and we got back to the more traditional style of not adding extra sugar and things like that. So not unlike Berliner, essentially.
Which was rather going to be my next question. Is really, I mean, this is a style I'm very familiar with the website, and a lot of your time goes to documenting breweries that closed between the First and Second World Wars. There was a massive closure of lambic breweries. And we saw just an absolute dying back of not just lambic, but sour beer styles in general. The big two, being out there were, of course, Berliner Weisse and lambics, and they just about died out for a while there. At least the traditional unsweetened types. I can't imagine being alive in, say, 1988 and trying to buy an unsweetened lambic. It would have been, in North America, completely impossible. But even in Brussels, it was probably quite hard at the time.
Yeah, I think that these types of sour styles have they share a common history in terms of their trajectory from a very local popular drink, popular in bars and cafes, to sort of starting to die out after World War II, and then with the reemergence of the craft beer scene starting in the early 2000s, you really started to see these come back. And be a bit more traditional. You mentioned the lambic breweries that have closed over the time. At one point, there were probably 250 lambic brewers, blenders, or cafe blenders, and today we're down to about 10.
And lambic, like Berliner Weisse, is not at this point, protected. We have two Berliner Weisses on the table, neither of which are from Berlin. One is from New Zealand, one of them is from Calgary. But lambic is very protected. It's like champagne, it's like cognac, it's like Bordeaux. You can't just make a beer in the style of a lambic and call it that. You can call it a barrel-aged Brettanomyces wheat-based beer, but you can't call it lambic. What's the je ne sais quoi? What's the magic behind lambic to you?
It's interesting that you mentioned the naming conventions of it, because while lambic has a certain amount of protection within Belgium and within the EU with the traditional specialty guaranteed seal, it doesn't rise to the same standards as, say, like the appellations of France or AOC or DOC type stuff when it comes to wine or cognac, like you mentioned, which is really unfortunate because, you asked about the je ne sais quoi of lambic. For me, it's more about the culture that surrounds it and the culture that upheld it over the last century or more, rather than just the beer itself, right? And so there's always an argument or a discussion to be had about, well, American brewers, they brew Kolsch or they brew a Vienna lager, and this seems to happen a lot with German styles, and I don't really know why, right? But the Belgians have been very vocal about their wish to keep lambic and name protected. It doesn't always work out. But I think, particularly in the U.S., a lot of American brewers are pretty irreverent towards it, and so they tend to back off and actually say lambic inspired or Geuze inspired or the méthode traditionnelle sort of naming.
That's fair. So this is a fun little side note. I would have been very, very, skeptical if you told me that, vegetable flavored beers were going to be a huge hit this year. But this cucumber Berliner Weisse, which tragically you're not drinking right now, Adam, because it's absolutely delicious. For those of you at home, I believe Adam has thus far in my conversations with him today described Berliner Weisse as trash, garbage, blasphemy, and something else. He's not a fan.
No, that is not true.
No, I don't think he uses the word blasphemy.
I enjoy a good traditional Berliner, right? I I think a good traditional Berliner, much in the same way as a good traditional Lambic, can be beautiful. It can be really well put together. I think where we start to get caught a little bit is this idea of, taking shortcuts to get what people think are the same results as a beer that takes a lot of time or a lot of skill to craft.
That's fair. So you'd be against, say, are traditional Berliner Weisses as made in Berlin very naturally fermented, or do they actually add a cultured souring component in the form of like a yogurt culture or what have you?
I think it varies. I think by brewery, right? And if hard pressed, I don't know that I could actually answer whether or not there's a brewery in Germany, or I guess in and around Berlin, that makes only Berliner and nothing else.
Okay.
Right, and I think that's a bit of a distinction to draw, because by and large, all the Lambic breweries only make Lambic. Right, and yeah, I don't know. I don't know if the German breweries are doing that same sort of thing or not. It's a good question.
Okay. So
in fact, I have a really good friend who is a Berliner Weiss expert. I should have asked him a little bit before this, but I should get you two in touch because he could give you all of the information on Berliner.
Well, that's fair, but I have you, so we will muddle through. So I was going to mention that's the New Zealand vegetable sour. We just got in today this new beer. It is a beet sour. Called Beets by Sinden, which is in my glass right now. I apologize that we don't have this on the tasting, but I only just discovered this on Monday. Far, far too late to put it in the tasting. It's really bloody weird, but beets are one of my favorite things in the whole world. I don't see the point behind, necessarily a potato-flavored beer. But, for some of the more strongly flavored root vegetables, why not? I mean, sunchokes are just about the most delicious thing in the world. Why not make a sunchoke flavored saison? Because that nuttiness and richness would just translate so well. Or like a beer de garde with them would be beautiful.
Yeah. There was, it was an American brewery. I even think we drank it together one time. It was like a sweet potato stout. And I think it was a sweet potato stout from the East Coast or something. I can't remember where it was from. But that's about the only root vegetable I've had in a beer.
Well,
lately.
The next time you're up, whenever the borders open and everything, we will have ourselves some cucumber Berliner Weiss and some beet Berliner Weiss, and you'll pretend to like it.
Yeah, I'm open for it.
Well, let's jump on to the cabin. This is their Staycation Berliner with Lactose. Now, down there in Montana, you are insulated from it, but the sour beer market here in Alberta right now is absolutely dominated by a beer called Establishment Jamrock, which is a blackberry and vanilla sour. It just absolutely runs the show here. It was supposed to be kind of a Christmas one-off. Excuse me, everyone. It is absolutely taken off, though. And to me, the Staycation, I won't say it's a copy because it doesn't have vanilla in it and has wildly more fruit, and it's Cabin are not followers. Cabin are very much leaders. Cabin could brew nothing but New England IPAs and make an absolute fortune all day long. But right now their seasonals are like a Dunkelweizen and a hopped Hefeweizen, which you would love, and they have a really well-made Vienna lager. And yeah, they're not afraid to just say, you know what, we'd make a lot of money if we just brewed another IPA. We're not going to do that. We're going to make this Vienna lager, and you people are going to like it. I kind of love them for that. So I would never claim this as a copy, not from Cabin. There are many brewers that would absolutely, copy other people's success. Cabin is not one of those people. So let's get into this.
The name, I think, is pretty apropos for what we're facing.
And it has come out since the outbreak. This is definitely an outbreak beer. And yeah, people are loving the beet beer because I also love beet beer. Victoria, is there such thing as a carrot beer or a carrot cake beer? I don't know, but I am famous for my love of carrot cake. If there was a carrot cake beer, I'd be right there for it. I even went into Booster Juice for their carrot cake smoothie a couple of months ago. It was awful, but I drank it anyway, and I actually got another one because I just love carrot cake so much. But yeah, I have not seen a carrot cake beer, although I would be really into it. I think that the best style for a carrot cake beer would probably be a big boozy imperial stout in the southern tier style, like with their creme brulee imperial stout and all that. I can't imagine anything else with carrot cake working.
Yeah, carrot cake stout, cinnamon. That would be good.
You could do an amber ale with it. I mean, there's ways.
I feel like that's a pretty prevalent thought right now in contemporary brewing. People come up with an idea and say, "Yeah, there are ways," and then they make those ways happen. I don't know if it's always successful, but it could be.
Well, I mean, Spectrum out of Vancouver, they made a birthday cake like pale lager, and it sounds awful. It does, and it's not something I would want to drink 6 of. But in the sense that they made a pale lager in a 6-pack that tasted exactly like birthday cake, they succeeded.
There's a brewery down here, a local brewery here in Kalispell, that makes a blonde ale with coffee, and I think it's one of my favorites.
Okay, so let's jump into the Staycation. So it's a laundry list of red berries. I don't remember all of them because there are 7 different fruits, but it's black currants and blackberries and cherries and raspberries and all sorts. And I love the color on this. It's got a very lovely, remarkably purpley. Like pink is very common in these beers, but actually getting the blue in there to get it kind of purpley is kind of neat. And I get the nice sweetness in the mouth, but the nose is so beautifully tart. You'll hate me for this, but this kind of reminds me a little bit of the Drie Fontenaine homage, and just the amount of different fruit notes I'm getting out of this. Not the same level of, crazy quality. Victoria asks, which Kalispell brewery? What's the name of that beer that you love, Adam?
It is the Coffee Blonde at Bias Brewing.
Oh, where's Bias Brewing? They're in Kalispell proper, or are they just outside?
Yeah, they're right on First Avenue, right off of Main Street.
How is the Montana beer scene right now? I know it had like a real hot minute a few years ago where everybody was saying, "Oh, Montana's the new Florida, Montana's the new Washington," sort of thing. People were talking about it. It was a big deal. What's the scene in Montana right now? How good or bad is it? What's happening there?
I don't know. Personally, I think the scene here in Montana, at least in this part of Montana, northwestern Montana, is probably circa craft beer 2013, 2014. So we're catching up. Slowly but surely, we're catching up.
Well, I'll say that in the year and change since you were last up, Alberta craft beer has completely changed. When the NHL starts up in proper, it's non-optional. You're gonna have to come up and see a Pens Flames game because, the breweries I can take you to, Adam. Oh, the breweries I can take you to. It's gone absolutely bananas here, and it's glorious.
Gosh, I did have some hazy IPAs from a brewery up in Calgary.
I think that was the very first couple batches of Super Saturation, because that had just come in when you when you were last here.
No. I'm talking like more recently, because there's someone who comes to he works at or partly owns a brewery up there in Calgary. I cannot remember the name, but he comes down here and provisions at our Costco, and also buys up all of the American beers that do not make it up your way.
Oh.
Much the same way I used to do at your store when, way back when. And
well, this is recorded, so I'm not going to say anything about what we used to do back when, in the weird old days.
I used to spend a lot of money.
And we'll leave it there. So we're gonna move on.
So what's the most fruit you're getting in there? Because it was all red berry in there, yeah. Yeah,
it's all red berries. I'd say I probably get more cherry on the nose, but the mouth is more raspberry blackberry, which I really like. I like that framboise character in the mid mouth.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that in terms of the brewing scene up in Alberta now, is it where is it situated in modern craft beer? Is it keeping up towards the West Coast sort of hazy trends, or did it move towards like the south of the U.S.? I mean, obviously we're talking about Berliners, and you've got a Florida Weiss there, and so
I think that we have enough.
all of those things had their moment in U.S. brewing hype.
Yep. But when you folks were, well into the IPA explosion of, say, 2010, things here were very early. They were very embryonic. They weren't as well evolved as they were in the U.S. And I realize that the craft beer explosion in the U.S. happened a little before that. But really, here, in terms of really crazy high-quality brewing locally happening, we're really like Blindman was kind of the first in 2014, 2015. And then really in terms of like lots of great breweries where I'm bringing in, 10, 15 new things every week, we're really only in the last 18 months, because in that time period we've seen SYC and Sea Change and Cabin and Establishment and 88, not open necessarily, but be something that I could access in Lethbridge. And really, they've all only opened in the last 3-4 years. So we've transitioned from being a market where people were clamoring for high-quality craft beer, and we were having to get it out of the U.S. or get it from Quebec or get it from B.C., to the point where people are clamoring for high-quality craft beer, and it's made like literally next door. It's the brewing scene here, I'd still say, Quebec and BC probably have an edge just because they've been doing it for so long. But I think that Alberta craft beer now is something that if you're a Ontario craft beer drinker and you've got Vancouver and Montreal on your list, I don't know why Calgary isn't supplanting one of the two. Like it's gotten so good, so incredibly good.
I've never made it up to Calgary yet. I've often contemplated flying out of Calgary. It's a bit of a drive, but I always do enjoy some of the craft beer news coming out of Canada in terms of the different laws and taxes amongst the provinces and the recent arguments over all of those things, which I'm sure you followed.
Oh, it's a big
pretty closely
fight all the time. Yes,
but. I don't know. It's a shame, I think, for people who really enjoy sour beer, and it might be the same up your way as well. But there's so much noise that it can become really difficult to find a focus and find a really well-crafted sour, no matter if it's a wild ale or a kettle sour or anything in between. Mixed cultures, mixed firm, or anything. There's so much noise. It's really hard to just focus on one thing anymore.
And I don't think that a good brewery needs to focus anymore. I mean, I remember the old stories of, when Russian River started doing sours and all the winemakers wouldn't come in because they didn't want Brettanomyces on their clothes and this, and this.
Oh my God.
And I think the attitudes, even in winemaking, towards wild yeast have wildly changed.
Absolutely.
Moderately intended. To people, wanting that wild yeast in their wines. We're going to move forward into the Florida Weiss here. Now, while we started with 2 Berliner Weisses, where the fruit is added as the very last step, you make a dry, clean, flavorless. Well, shouldn't say flavorless, unflavored sour beer, and you can make a very, very characterful sour beer that way. The difference between a Berliner Weiss and a Florida Weiss is the flavoring is added at the very end, be it by a syrup or by it being thrown into the bright tank as the beer is clarifying. It's added at the very, very last step. With a Florida Weiss, the fruit is added either at the fermentation step or during the boil or during fermentation itself. The fruit's added earlier, and it's not usually added as a syrup. It's far more often added as like whole fruits or as fruit juice. and that is actually the difference in style. Is that to say that people are not making, Berliner Weisses where they add the flavoring ingredients earlier and just saying, hey, this is actually a Berliner Weiss, because they want to capture that broader, name brand recognition of Berliner Weiss versus Florida Weiss? No, there are probably a great many Berliner Weisses that are actually Florida Weisses. They just want the more common name. But Florida Weiss is kind of a new, sexy style. For those of you who joined us with Shane from Blindman, he talked about the difference actually at quite length. And this is the new version of Florida Weiss and Blindman, their third edition. This is the lemons, limes, and clementines. So it's a citrus Florida Weiss. And their best yet. The citrus in this is just absolutely spectacular. Scotty, the issue with the bringing in lots of anything is I actually get hard caps from everybody on what I get. I'll ask for, hey, I'd like 10 flats of that. That's cool, Kyle. You get 3 flats, and you're lucky to get it. It's nice to be on the absolute leading edge of the curve with this, because we get amazing things. We get things that nobody else gets, and it's really, really cool. But it's also the thing, like this past weekend where I brought down the Fruity Pebbles and I brought down the Double Dare, and by Monday mid-afternoon we were broadly sold out. Like it's Wednesday night and I'm completely out of Fruity Pebbles, and I'm broadly close to being out of Double Dare.
I will have to add that Fruity Pebbles, I don't know much about the beer, but the cereal is on point. It's one of the best.
Fruity Pebbles has changed a bit in terms of beers. So when it first came out, it was a double dry hop milkshake IPA with lacto and fruit. So it was basically all the things. The new version is it's a triple berry sour. Aaron, would you give that a try? I cannot open that. For any of you struggling with your lambic bottle the way I am, you can use a corkscrew on them. I don't have a corkscrew to hand. Some of these older lambics, they get a little sticky.
Oh, yeah. What's the vintage on the Beersel? 13, 14, I think. I feel like I remember.
So yeah, best before 2033. So yeah, it's a 2013.
Yeah, it would be.
Lorraine, yes, we are getting some more Fruity Pebbles. Like about 4 flats arriving Friday, because that's what they capped me at, was 4 flats.
Kyle, I think you just hit on something fairly interesting that some folks might not have just picked up on. You said the best by date on that bottle is 2033. Yeah.
It is, yes.
So I think it's pretty telling that, legally, by EU standards, they're obligated to put a best by date on those bottles, but they are not kidding by saying that those particular beers, a nice Geuze, can go for 15 to 20 years with no problem. Whereas I think probably the rest of the cans that you've opened so far are best consumed fresh,
yes.
Right?
They're not expected to age very long. They're not going to age very long. Mm-hmm. And those fruit characters and those bright, fresh hop characteristics that we get out of them, they're not meant for the long term. They're going to fade fairly quickly. So let's talk briefly about the Blindman Lemons, Limes, and Clementines, a beer so tasty we had to taste it twice. So this is a beer that we had during our tasting with Shane from Blindman Brewery a couple 3 weeks back, which was just a massive success. Shane was spectacularly good. But one of the beers we tasted that night was the brand new, at that time, Lemons, Limes, and Clementines. It's still only been out for a month. We've had a couple of earlier versions of the Florida Weiss from them. I really love this. Like, the citrus character is so bright and so clean and so juicy. I get the fresh lime juice. I get the fresh tropical fruit. I would be lying if I said I knew the difference between clementines and mandarin oranges. It just smells like mandarin oranges to me. But it's pretty and it's fresh and it's fun. And it goes down so easily. All of these beers that we've had up to this point, one of the things I really like about them so far is the alcohol hovers right around 4% alcohol. We got 4 flat on the cucumber. We've got, I think, 3.8 on the cabin. Yeah, 3.8. And then this, I think, is 4.2. 4.5. So all of these are, less alcoholic than a bottle of Pilsner or a can of Pils. These are light, they're super flavorful, they're super sessionable, and because of that tartness, one of the things you learn when you do like a classical wine education is you discover acidity is one of the things that really keeps you going back for another glass. You have a sip, you have a glass, and you're like, oh wow, my mouth feels really dry. I should get another glass. These are all very Moorish, which I really appreciate about them.
Moorish, huh?
Very Moorish. What my good friends will sometimes call a glue wine.
Ah, yes. What a term.
It's a lovely term.
The old Van de Soif,
Mm-hmm.
Van de Copain.
Van de Copain, I'm not familiar with. What's the little
It's just
translation on
another.
that?
It's like a wine for friends. It's just like pass it around, drink it, don't really think about it. Just sort
A
of.
wine of companionship. That's a lovely
Right.
term. Yeah, I like that.
Right. Yeah.
No, these are very companionable beers. They're wines that are beers that are very sociable and very friendly and very interesting in that way. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I was actually just talking about Van de Soif and Van de Copain with a couple friends earlier today from France when we were talking about different lambics that were blended with grape and how they tend to sort of move more towards the wine side when they're young.
Well, Adam, I'm going to break into our lovely conversation about sour beers just before we get to the lambic. And
Sure.
I'm just going to talk about what we've got coming up, because we have some really interesting things coming up shortly here. For example, we have a wine tasting this Friday. It's a Californian wine tasting featuring 3 whites and a rosé, featuring winemaker Ryan Sturm, which I went to California with my wife this past summer. I'm getting frantic instructions by Aaron, our camera guy, on where to put the wines. But I went to California, and I spent some time at some incredible wineries. I went to Brock's Cellars. I went to Donkey and Gouda, and some incredible, highly rated wineries that I really, really loved. But where I spent an entire day, the winery where I personally had the most fun was at Sturm, with Ryan Sturm. He and I both love Riesling to a completely inappropriate amount. So he's the preeminent American Riesling maker, so we're going to do one of his Rieslings. We're going to do, oddly enough, in a can, one of the very best Sauvignon Blancs in the store. We're going to do his very showy and pretty slightly orange Malvasia, and we're going to do his rosé. This is a wine tasting that is absolutely going to sell out. We only got 60 bottles of the Riesling, so this is one of those that's going to be limited by quantity. But yes, it's going to be me and Ryan Sturm hanging out, talking about wine. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then next week, we, of course, are doing a beer tasting 1 week from today. And we are going to have the beers from Annex. So every single style in the world, as long as it is pale. So they have a pale ale, a New England pale ale, an extra pale ale, and a pale ale with black tea and lemons. So I'm still working with the folks from Annex, getting a guest speaker. One of the brewmasters is what I'm hoping I'm going to get. Going to be a lot of fun. $20 as always. Going to be a really, really fun beer tasting, I think. So let's get to your particular specialty, Adam. Let's talk lambic. Let's talk about what you love to talk about. Let's talk about what you are, one of the more well-read personalities out there. Let's talk about this Oude Beersel lambic we got going on here.
Sure. What is it that you would like to know or talk about?
Well, why don't you introduce the beer and why don't you introduce the style? I'm actually going to step away for a second just to use the restroom here, and I'll let you introduce the beer and talk about it a little bit, because this is literally your area of expertise.
So the Oude Beersel Oude Geuze is a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old lambic, all aged in wood. Either smaller barrels like pipes or larger foeders, and at a certain time whenever the master blender decides, he'll pull his 3-year-old, his 2-year-old, and his 1-year-old stock, and he'll create a blend. The 3-year-old lambic that's been in barrels is obviously fully attenuated, fully fermented out. There's really not much left in it in terms of sugar, and so that's what generally gives it a lot of depth. The 2-year-olds are brought in to sort of balance it out. There's a little bit more left in there to sort of help it develop in the bottle. But where all of it really comes from is the 1-year-old lambic, which is still very young. It still has a lot of fermentable sugar left in it. And so when that blending happens and then when it's bottled, what you end up with is this blend of beers that will ferment again, a re-fermentation, a secondary fermentation in the bottle, and that's what creates that that sort of really iconic, carbonation in a Geuze. Oftentimes, you'll hear a lot of older folks in Brussels refer to Geuze as the champagne of Brussels, not just because of the carbonation that's contained within that bottle, but also because traditionally, to bottle a Geuze, what the brewers or blenders would do, they would either save or collect old champagne bottles, whether they're 75 centiliter or 35.5 or 37.5 centiliter bottles. They would keep those, they would collect them, clean them off, take off all the labeling, and then bottle it in that. And let's see. Did somebody say turn on the mic? Can I not be heard?
No, that's my mic, Adam. They definitely didn't want to hear me pee.
Oh, that's what they were talking about.
No, it's not an issue with your mic. And for what it's worth, I unplugged both my mic and my earpiece, not just because the cord wouldn't possibly reach that long, but because it would be bad manners.
So I was just talking about the idea of the champagne of Brussels, not only because of the carbonation that's there within the bottle, but also because they want to use either old 75 centiliter or old split bottles of champagne, empty champagne bottles, and use those for bottling. We talked a little bit about the re-fermentation process and sort of where it comes from in terms of the young and the old lambic and things like that. But there was a good question, I think, way back when I was talking about, or when you and I were talking about the expiration dates of, Craig asked why can they last so long?
Yeah, he did. And also, we are starting to lose your audio, or at least I am. Could you maybe lean in a little bit with the audio?
I mean, I've got audio in my headphones. Can people still hear?
I can hear again. Yeah, it got a little quiet there for a second. I'm not sure if that's just you leaned back into your chair or what that was.
Yeah, sometimes my internet blips out, but
no,
yeah. So the question was why can they last so long? Like we were saying, they put a 20-year best by date on there after bottling. So something that's good until 2033 was obviously bottled in 2013, 20 years earlier. This is where I think the biggest difference between a wild ale and a kettle sour and a lambic exists, because there's just so much wild yeast, wild bacteria, the microflora that's contained within this lambic. It just tends to, in a good cellar, develop more slowly, develop over time. There's so much carbonation in it that it really keeps oxygen ingress out, so you won't find a lot of oxidation so long as you've got a great cork and you've not really transported it or kept it at a stable temperature, without light. So I've had 25, 30-year-old bottles of Geuze that come out absolutely beautifully. And so the Oude Beersel Geuze, Oude Beersel is a revived lambic brewery. It closed briefly between 2002 and 2007 or so, because the original owner sort of retired, and then subsequently passed away a few years ago. But it was revived by Gert Christensen, and they've really brought that label and that brand back. It's located in the village of Beersel, which is right outside the town of Brussels. It's up on a hill, so you can sort of look out over the Pajottenland and the Seine Valley, where these beers are principally made. And this is probably as classic of a traditional representation of the style as you can get. But it's just it's a beautiful beer. It really is. And I wish I had one to drink. I actually drank a 2000. Let me find it here. Kyle, I think you'll recognize this here.
Yes, I do.
All right.
That's the 08, right? Yeah.
The 07. Yeah.
07s,
I did this is back from when...
We actually still have a couple of those to sell.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they're
a beautiful
sexy
beer right
as
now.
anything.
It's an absolutely beautiful beer right now. It is the 2007s that you have were from the first release of the brewery after it got revived. It also won the gold, I think, at the World Beer Awards in 2008 or 2009 with that vintage. Beautiful carbonation, still dusty, musty, has a little bit of that mushroom cheesy note to it. And again, that's just a complexity that you don't get in, a kettle sour.
Now, I'll also say, when we talk about Geuze, this is an Oude Beersel Geuze, and you talked about it as a beer brewery, but, it's Blindman, Florida Weisse. This is a beer where all of the beer was brewed at Blindman. It was, fermented at Blindman. It was packaged at Blindman. But with Geuze, it's not the case. It's a collaboration almost always. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, entirely always. It's always a variety of different breweries that get together that exchange young beer to create a greater blend. Do you want to talk about kind of the swapping of casks and how Geuze and how Lambic in general is made?
Yeah, so in the Lambic world, particularly back when it was way more diverse than it is today, you had a certain amount of brewers, and past that you had a lot of people who were blending, right? If you talk to the brewers and the blenders of Lambic, brewing is not the difficult part. Brewing a Lambic recipe is pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. It's a little more time consuming than a regular beer. But past that, the blending is really where the art comes in. And if you were only a blender and not a brewer, you would, during the traditional brewing season, which only lasts from sort of late October, early November until the end of spring, so April-ish, mid to late April, you would contract with all these different Lambic brewers to have them brew you a batch of beer, and after it cooled down in the cool ship, they would either put it into barrels, or today they put it into like the big plastic IBC tanks or a stainless steel tank, and then they'll ship it over or truck it over to the blendery rather than a brewery, and they'll pump it into their barrels, let it ferment and mature for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, however long it is, and then once it sort of matures into this nice ripe lambic, they will take it and start to blend it.
So this says Beersel on the label, this might or very likely would have beer from Brasserie Boone or Lindemans or Drie Fonteinen or whoever.
In particular, Oude Beersel has all of their wort brewed by Bone. And it's to a little bit of a different recipe than regular Bone Lambic. And so Bone will brew, X number of batches for them in a season. It'll all get shipped over to Oude Beersel. And then that's where Gert will take it and, put it in foeders or pipes or different size barrels, let it mature, and go on from there. But
So Beersel actually at the time that this was brewed doesn't actually brew beer themselves. They're buying it from other places.
they're buying wort, right? Which is beer. It's like embryonic beer, right? Before it's, beer before it's really beer.
Strongly flavored, fun sugar water.
It very much is. It very much is, right? And so just to give you a bit of an idea, right now there are only 4 blenders, lambic blenders, that sort of, 5 really, 4 or 5 lambic blenders that don't do any of their own brewing, right? That just source wort from other places. And there are currently about 9 or 10 lambic brewers who not only brew for themselves and blend their own beers, but also brew for some of these blenders and swap wort and things like that.
So who are the brewers and who are the blenders? Who are the big players that people should be looking for on store shelves? Again, like Cantillon sells out the second it gets released. It's kind of like the rare Ardbegs. But who are the big players in lambic that people should be kind of watching for on shelves?
Right now, the brewers are Driefonteinen, Boon, Cantillon, De Troc, Girardin, Lindemans, Mort Subit, Timmermans, and the newest player on the block, Lambic Fabrique, which just is Flemish for Lambic Factory. And the current blenders that you would be more familiar with or that you would see out there in commercial land are Oude Beersel, which we're drinking, De Cam, Hansen's, which I know you absolutely love them.
I do. And
Geuze Tilquin. And so those are the 4 main blenders and the brewers, and they all have their sort of specific or well-known beers. But I think in the end it's really important to try sort of that entire range, because lambic as a style in and of itself is so diverse, even within this small community.
Wonderful. While I was away, did you discuss exactly what a Geuze is, why it's important?
I talked about how it was a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old beers, 3-year-old lambics. And the question there that I see is how do you blend a beer? And truly, it is not anything crazy or from a process standpoint. It's just you have a bunch of barrels, and over years and years of experience, these blenders sort of understand the characteristics of their own beer, and they will taste various barrels, however many they need to make a full batch, whether it's a 5 hectoliter or 1 hectoliter, or however much they want to blend. They'll determine what bottle or what barrels are going to go into it, and then they'll just put it in a blending tank, and that'll be it. Now, each brewer or blender has their own proportion of, say, 3-year-old or 1-year-old or 2-year-old. Sometimes, 3-year-old lambic is very full of character, very full of taste, and it's also very valuable. And so
it's really hard to carbonate because there's effectively no residual sugar left, and it's very characterful, sometimes too characterful.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it can be, it's very blasé, right? It's very, very woody. And so that might only comprise of 10, 15, 20% of the blend. The 2-year-old lambic might be a little bit more. It tends to be, not so woody or heavy in characteristics like that, but still has, a decent body. Might have a little bit more of those fruity esters. The wheat might be coming out a little bit more in it, and so they'll pull that. 2-year-old lambic is also heavily used for fruited lambic, right? So a lot of times fruited lambic is generally just 2-year-old lambic with the fruit macerated in it, whole or frozen, or however they decide to do it. And then the 1-year-old is where all that extra sugar comes from.
Now, I mean, blending lambic with lambic is, very traditional, but it's, not all that's done. I know that there have been some blends of lambic with other styles, like, your wedding beer, for example, which I managed to drink myself absolutely sick on at your own wedding a few years back. You actually had a beer made for you because you're just such a big deal. Why don't you tell us about the beer you had made for yourself for your wedding? Because that was so delicious.
Oh, gosh, that was so long ago.
Oh, it wasn't that bloody long. Don't make us seem older than we are.
The beer was made that long ago, though. It's been 5 years or more now, I think. No, the beer that I had blended for my wedding was a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old lambic from a particular lambic brewery that I'm not allowed to publicly talk about, and also a blend of fresh Fantôme Saison, blended, bottled, re-fermented in the bottle, and then that's what we used as one of 4 table beers at the wedding. But
which was just the fanciest damn wedding. Just the absolute fanciest.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it fancy. I would call it more of a 4-day party in the woods.
Yes, under a fancy like white silk tent. Yes.
No, that came with the venue. I didn't have to rent that.
That's fair.
I think I didn't really run the budget on that. That was Steph's job. But that particular style, when we talk about blending lambic and other beers, most often it was usually a saison, and that's what they would call a bière de coupage, like a cut beer, and they would use the lambic to I suppose it could go either way, right? Either to bolster the characteristics of the lambic or to sort of cut back on the acidity of the lambic. And there are lots of really, really great examples of it. The Beersel Matina, which I think I got at your place one time, a long time ago.
That'd be like 8-9 years now, but yes.
Yeah, it's one of the classic representations of the style. But
now, Chad asks, I was wondering, you can't really call it beer without hops. Now, these are beers without perceptible hops. You can't taste them necessarily, but these are absolutely beers with hops. But versus how everybody else treats hops with this, let's keep it away from light and heat and oxygen. The use of hops in lambic is absolutely unique in the brewing world in the fact that they encourage oxidation and age and light and everything else. They want these to be as basically rotten as possible. They don't rot, but they're very heavily oxidated.
Well, I guess when we think about hops in sort of the modern sense, we think about hops as adding all of this extra character to the beer, whether it's these tropical fruity type hops or these piney sort of resinous hops. But we have to remember in the old brewing tradition, hops were less for flavor and more for preservative qualities. And so what the lambic brewers do is they take that to sort of the nth degree, and the hops that they use in lambic are always aged hops, with very few exceptions, though there are some. And when I talk about aged hops, I mean they literally take either whole cone or pellets, and they let them sit in their burlap sacks or whatever for years, 2, 3, 4 years or more. And what it does is it retains the preservative qualities. And they're always low alpha acid hops, and so it retains its preservative qualities while the hop flavor sort of dissipates over time. And that also, I think, lends to lambic being able to age and stand up to the test of time as well as it does.
Now, you're a little bit of a lambic curmudgeon, but where do you come down on things like, I know here, Twisted Stave from Colorado, we can get a 6-pack of regular 355 cans. Is there a lot of hype behind sour beers that doesn't need to be there? Or is some of it just necessary? These are very limited items that you can only make so much of it on a reasonable scale.
I think it probably used to be like that when sour beer was just starting to pick up steam in the U.S. in terms of recognition and style and acceptance and enjoyment. Some of the rarest beers in the past decade and a half have been, U.S. sour beers. I mean, think back to the original Dogfish Head Festina Lent,
or a Cascade Everything, yes,
or the Cascade Everything, or the big like Dogfish Head, Russian River, Avery.
Oh yeah,
there's probably
Consecration,
one more.
or getting really old. We could get back like to Isabel Proximus, yeah.
The big collaboration, the Isabel Proximus, and you were involved in that trading scene on Rate Beer.
Hey, I still have a bottle of Isabel on display in the store. I still have my empty bottle of Isabel if anybody really cares enough to see it.
So that's when sour beers were at this embryonic American stage, and they were all the rage. Today, these breweries have had so much time to sort of scale up their production and their understanding of how these beers are made, that it becomes not so uncommon that they can become regular releases. You talked about Crooked Stave a little bit. When Crooked Stave came out, 2010, 2011.
Yeah, it's been 10 years.
Yeah, it was Hill Farmstead even is celebrating their 10th anniversary this year, which is crazy. They've become able to produce these beers regularly, and so maybe the hype and the style has dialed back a little bit, but you can get really, really good sours and wild ales and saisons, mixed fermentation saisons from these breweries now very easily. The Crooked Stave cans I haven't seen up here, obviously, because it's Montana and we don't get great distribution. But man, I remember when Surette Reserva was, it still is one of the best American representations of that style. It's one of my favorite beers, and so it's grown just much like the brewing industry has grown. The sour brewing industry has grown a lot too in the U.S.
No, that's fair. Now I have a question here. Lots of hype around Flanders Red for years. Is there anything commercial the person could try? I always refer people to Roquefort, Rodenbach, because that's that's the one we can get here. We always have Rodenbach. Mm-hmm. We can't get any of the really interesting American ones like Red Poppy or what have you, but we can always get Rodenbach, and Rodenbach's always good.
Is Duchess de Bourgogne? Is that an Old Brown, or is that a Flanders Red? I can't even remember. Yeah, it's a Flanders Red.
Yeah, it is, and it's intermittently available. It's not always around. And when we can get it, it doesn't sell worth a damn, so don't always bring it in.
And there's also the American Monk's Cafe Flemish Red.
Yeah, which we unfortunately don't get here because it is delicious.
Which is absolutely phenomenal to use if you're making Belgian beef stew for the stewing process. Other Flanders Reds, that is...
I think for this market, it's kind of Rodenbach or nothing. We can't get Locks.
Yeah. And
but Rodenbach's delicious. You should always get Rodenbach because it's great.
And that's one of those styles that and Oude Brewing is one of those endangered beer styles that even as sour popularity has picked up, it doesn't seem to have taken off along with it, which is unfortunate because those are all really good beers.
Yeah, they're kind of like woody, cherryish, carbonated balsamic vinegars, which is great. I love that style.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with any of that.
No, those are all good things.
But
where do you see the sour beer industry as a whole moving? Are we moving more towards the kettle sours and the fruited sours? Are we moving to more new lambic breweries? What's going to happen over the horizon in your view, Adam?
I think it's going to vary by region. Truly, lambic breweries I think are going to stay the course. We've seen a lot of home blenders and home brewers in Belgium kind of come up and start to try to really work with lambic. if they can get it, if they can convince a brewery to sell them, X amount of gallons of lambic or liters of lambic or whatever. In the U.S., there are people who are absolutely doing it right. There are other breweries who are, just sort of jumping on that bandwagon and making kettle sours and pushing them out as fast as they can. And that's fine. I mean, there are some really good ones out there. But I kind of feel like the American brewing scene in general is pretty schizophrenic. It sort of bounces around between, I want to make this really quick kettle sour, this new hazy IPA versus, we've let these stouts age in barrels for, 6 months, a year, 2 years or whatever. And now we've thrown all these adjuncts in them, and things like that. So I don't know. And this whole pandemic, I think, is really going to put the squeeze on some breweries. And so we might even see some of these disappear.
Up here, at least, we've seen at least the really good craft breweries have, socially distant lineups, not just out the door, but around the block.
That's good.
I have earned some absolute death stares in Calgary by, showing up and looking at the massive lineup out the door at Cabot and quietly going in the side door and getting my beer where everybody else is going to be waiting 45 minutes.
I would give you that look too.
The pandemic has been great for local breweries. It's been very fun to see just how much, with nothing else to, really look forward to in some cases. Some people are just hanging on every word of really cool breweries to say, you're doing a new single hop IPA, let me write that in red pen on my calendar, and I love it. It's been very fun.
I think it's really hard to call it, a silver lining because this pandemic is terrible. But I think it's really pushed people to look inward and locally for some of their things. And for me, lambic in particular is a hyper-local product. It's very important for the history and the culture and the people of Brussels and Belgium. It's a piece of cultural heritage, for sure. But I think, when you ask about the future of brewing or sours have really, really caught on, I think it's pretty indicative that, bigger, some of the legacy craft brewers or some of the macro breweries, they've started to make sours. They're experimenting with sours. They're putting out small batches, but they haven't bought in fully. And so, I know you've probably introduced customers to sour beers, their first sour beer, and it takes some explaining. It's not what they're used to. And I think that has sort of, dampened its popularity a little bit. But
it's absolutely going bananas here. I can't really say that I've had anybody that I've introduced to sour beer that hasn't immediately come back and said, please, just like that, in 5 different ones.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Actually gone nuts here.
That's the thing, right? But getting people to the step of being ready to try those beers and not skeptical about them is pretty indicative of where the style is going, I think. But I mean, that's my view on it. I am pretty disconnected from the beer world outside of lambic anymore. I mean,
it's literally what you run an incredibly well updated website about. When a new lambic comes out, you've got it, on the site in a couple of hours. I brought you in because you're literally the world authority on this thing. I know you always say, well, I'm not a brewer, I can't really be the world authority, but
I'm not.
You're very up to date on everything that's changing, and that's why I absolutely had to have you.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for joining us, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been and it's been good to see you again. Gosh, it's been so long.
It really has. I had been very remiss in coming down to see you even before the pandemic, and now we're kind of put off till, maybe fall at best.
Hey, I think, Kyle, there's one more question in here that I think needs to be answered. What is the sediment in the bottom of the Oude Beersel, for interest's sake?
Yeah.
That is just organic sediment. Whether it's yeast
lees,
or Yeah, the yeast, the lees, that is what's in there, and that is why. I mean, you can even see it in the bottom. The bottom of this glass. There's a little bit of sediment right in there, and that's the sign of an unfiltered, sort of unadulterated, high quality bottle conditioned beer.
For the person who asked, John, where is the hand? The hand had to go babysit a smaller hand. So the hand is not here tonight. Yeah. Well, Grant, if you haven't enjoyed sour beers to this point, it may just not be your flavor profile. Lambic's great, but it takes everything that we've had in sour beers so far, and it dials it up a bit. Far away. Go ahead.
Can I disagree a bit there?
I would be incredibly remiss if I didn't let you.
I think sour American sour styles, Berliners, and things like, particularly ones that are hastily made and kettle soured, are done quickly, right? And that's fine. That is something that people do enjoy. But I think truly when you get into a well-aged lambic, a well-made lambic, particularly one that is traditional in nature and not sweetened like a Lindemans or a Timmermans or something like that. And don't get me wrong, Lindemans and Timmermans makes beautiful lambic before it goes into the process of being sweetened. Lambic beer shouldn't be sour per se. It should blend a little bit of acidity, some earthiness, some mustiness, some horse blanket type funkiness. So it's not just in your face sour all the time, right? But I really truly think that lambic is a good introduction to sour beer rather than sour beer being a good introduction to lambic. I think eventually everyone who gets into sour beers finds their way to lambic and doesn't really look back in the end.
That's actually incredibly informative. I never thought of lambic that way. I always thought it was one of those things you kind of have to ease your way into, whereas kettle sours are so immediately accessible. But I could absolutely see it being the other way around.
I think, yeah. I mean, it can be super difficult to experience one before the other and then form an opinion of one based on the other. I mean, for me, they're two totally separate beasts. I know what I'm getting into when I'm getting into an American sour beer versus a mixed fermentation beer from Jester King or Crooked Stave or places like that versus a lambic. There's a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum is a kettle soured whatever, whether it's a Berliner or a Florida Weiss or anything, a golden sour, and on the other end of that spectrum is lambic, and everything in between it can be good, bad, and there's bad lambics too. But
yes, the Chapeau banana is the most nightmarish thing I've ever tasted.
Oh, well, you haven't had the Chapeau, for those listening, is a Detroit brand, but you've not had or experienced the B12 Energy Lambic from old school Detroit.
Oh my God. That sounds like the worst thing I could possibly imagine.
I don't think any bottles of that exist anymore outside of the cellar at Culminator in Antwerp at this point.
That's a good thing for planet Earth. Yes.
But
I think we'll call it a night there, Adam. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, it was good to see you again, buddy.
It was good to see you too. And for everybody else, we will see you this Friday for the wine tasting, or we'll see you a week from tonight for our Annex tasting, where we'll have someone from Annex hopefully joining us. I've got the email out there. They just haven't got back to me yet. For myself and for Adam, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful evening, and if you have any last-minute questions, he and I will respond to them in the text. Thank you all very much tonight. Good night, and goodbye.